The silver goblet caught the lamplight like a promise of death. Isaiah Dunmore's hands trembled as he counted the peach pits scattered across his master's ledger, each one a life ruined, each one a debt unpaid. He counted every lash, every broken hope, as his spirit crumbled under a master's cruel obsession. Louisiana, 1857. The air hung thick with secrets and sugarcane smoke. On Dunmore Plantation, the master's house gleamed with polished silver and hymn phrases, while in the quarters men learned to move like shadows. Isaiah had learned to read more than just the orchard's seasons. He could read the ledger's margins, where Edward Dunmore recorded his fruit exchanges, cryptic marks beside names, dates beside favors. The master's obsession with trading fruit for flesh had created its own twisted economy. 28 years old, Isaiah moved through the plantation like a ghost who remembered being human. It was Cora who whispered the truth. Her voice cracked like dry bark when she told Isaiah about Jacob, his younger brother, barely 19, with dreams still bright in his eyes. Master called him to the study, she said. Offered him fruit. When Jacob refused, her words dissolved into the Louisiana humidity. 7 days later, Jacob was dead. Sickness, the master wrote in his clean ledger. But the whispers told a different story. Isaiah's hands moved mechanically through the peach baskets, but his mind was mapping every corner of the master's routine. The silver goblet, polished each morning by the housegirl. The study where ledger pages rustled with secrets. The daughter who sat silent during her father's business meetings. The master's obsession had created patterns, predictable as harvest seasons, deadly as summer fever. And patterns Isaiah knew could be broken, each night. Isaiah lay awake, listening to the sounds of celebration drift from the master's house. Crystal clinking, piano music, laughter that cut through the darkness like a blade. While they feasted, he plotted. The ledger held the truth. The goblet held the wine. And the orchard, his orchard, held the fruit that had become currency for shame. Before we continue this story of justice served cold, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Don't forget to subscribe, because stories like Isaiah's deserve to be heard. The breaking came not with violence, but with silence. Isaiah stood in the study one evening, delivering fruit as commanded, and watched his master's daughter arrange fresh peaches in a silver bowl. Her hands moved with practiced precision. She had done this before. She looked up once, met Isaiah's eyes, and he saw the knowledge there. She knew about Jacob. She had always known. That night, Isaiah stared at his reflection in the water barrel and saw a stranger. The boy who had taught Jacob to climb peach trees was gone. In his place stood something harder, something that could count suffering like harvest tallies and plan justice like planting seasons. The silver goblet would shine again. The fruit would ripen, and Edward Dunmore's obsession would finally feed on itself. This is the true story of Isaiah Dunmore, a young man whose soul was shattered by relentless cruelty, and whose silence could no longer bear the weight of his master's obsession. While the master's house gleamed with polished brass and fine china, Isaiah Dunmore's world was shrinking, one obsessive command at a time. But to understand how a man's spirit breaks, you must first see what it was before the breaking began. Isaiah had been 7 when his fingers first learned the difference between ripe and bitter fruit. His mother, before the fever took her, had taught him to read the orchard like a book, every branch telling stories of seasons past and harvests yet to come. Jacob, 3 years younger, had followed Isaiah everywhere in those days. Through the peach groves at dawn, past the apple trees heavy with promise, around the pear trees that dropped their sweetness like tears. "Teach me the secret," Jacob would whisper, watching Isaiah select fruit with the precision of a jeweler choosing diamonds. "There is no secret," Isaiah would reply. "Only listening." Edward Dunmore's interest in Isaiah began the summer Isaiah turned 16. It started with glances that lingered too long during fruit deliveries. Compliments that felt more like evaluations than praise. "This boy has fine hands," the master had said to his overseer, running his pale fingers along Isaiah's wrist as he inspected a basket of pears. Delicate work requires delicate instruments. The ledger entries began that same week. Simple marks at first. Isaiah's name, dates, single words. Study, fruit, good. But as months passed, the annotations grew more detailed, more possessive. The silver goblet appeared in the study like an altarpiece. Emily, the master's daughter, polished it each morning with the same mechanical precision she brought to arranging her father's gifts. The ritual evolved slowly. Isaiah would bring the day's finest selections. The master would pour wine, deep red, expensive, imported from France. Then came the questions that weren't really requests. "Taste this peach, boy. Tell me if it's sweet enough." The goblet would catch the lamplight, and Isaiah would know that refusing meant consequences that rippled beyond himself. In the quarters, the other enslaved workers developed their own language of warnings. Jeremiah, the stable hand, would whistle specific songs when the master was in his particular moods. Cora, who worked the kitchen, learned to read the daughter's face like weather signs. When Miss Emily arranges fruit in the silver bowl, Cora would murmur to the other women, "We know someone's being called to the study." The house servants spoke in glances and half-finished sentences. They all knew about the ledger, though none had seen its pages. They all knew about the goblet, though only Emily was permitted to touch it. The degradation was methodical, like preparing soil for planting. Each humiliation built upon the last. Each compliance demanded with greater specificity. The master kept detailed records, not just of the encounters, but of responses, who resisted, who complied, who broke fastest. Isaiah's entries filled multiple pages, chronicling his transformation from defiant boy to obedient instrument. Subject shows remarkable adaptability. One entry read, "Responds well to familial pressure. Recommend expanding protocols to include younger specimens." Jacob's name first appeared in the ledger on a Tuesday in March. Younger brother shows promise. Same delicate hands, greater resistance. Begin cultivation protocols. Isaiah had tried to warn him. But how do you explain degradation to someone whose spirit hasn't yet learned to bend? How do you describe a cage to someone who still believes in doors? "He asked me to bring him fruit," Jacob had said, confusion bright in his young eyes. "Said it was time I learned the finer points of service." Isaiah had felt his world tilt. The master wasn't just expanding his collection, he was completing it. Emily Dunmore was 24 and had never questioned her role in her father's rituals. She arranged the fruit, polished the goblet, sat quietly in the hall during her father's meetings with the houseboys. Her diary, kept locked in her bureau, contained its own form of ledger. Papa's business with the orchard boys continues. I find myself wondering what Mother would have thought. But such questions serve no purpose. She had watched Isaiah's transformation over the years with the detached interest of someone observing a garden's seasonal changes. Natural, inevitable, part of the proper order of things. That night, as Isaiah stared at his reflection in the water barrel, he saw nothing. The boy who once dreamed had vanished, replaced by whatever his master's obsession demanded him to be. But in that emptiness, something new was growing. Something that could plan, something that could wait, something that could turn sweetness into poison and service into vengeance. The first act of defiance was so small, the master didn't notice. Isaiah moved one item in the study, just an inch to the left. It was nothing. It was everything. The silver letter opener that usually lay parallel to the ledger now sat at a slight angle. Such a minor disruption in Edward Dunmore's precisely ordered world. Yet Isaiah felt the power in it, the knowledge that he could alter his master's domain, however minutely. For 3 days Isaiah watched. The master entered his study each morning, reviewed his ledger, sipped his coffee, and never noticed the change. That small rebellion taught Isaiah his first crucial lesson. His master's obsession with control made him blind to everything else. Isaiah began studying the plantation's rhythms like a conductor learning a symphony. Emily polished the goblet every Tuesday and Friday morning at precisely 10:15. The master took his wine at sunset, always from the same bottle, always in the same chair. Cook Mary prepared the evening fruit selections at 4 o'clock, arranging them in the silver bowl that Emily had polished hours earlier. The daughter would carry the bowl to the study, set it beside the goblet, and retreat to her chair in the hallway. Every Tuesday, the ritual intensified. That was when the master consulted his ledger most carefully, when he made his selections, when he sent word to the quarters for fruit delivery services. Isaiah committed every detail to memory. Which floorboards creaked, which servants could be trusted, which shadows offered concealment. Isaiah's first real test came during harvest week. He deliberately swapped 2 fruit crates, moving the premium peaches destined for the master's table to the workers' allotment, replacing them with fruit that was ripe but unremarkable. The discovery was swift and brutal. The overseer found the switched crates within hours, and Isaiah felt the lash across his back that evening. 10 strikes for carelessness, delivered in front of the other workers as a lesson in attention to detail. But as Isaiah bit down on the leather strap, he learned something valuable. Punishment meant he had been noticed. The master's perfect system could be disrupted, even if the cost was high. 2 weeks later, Isaiah tried a different approach. He left a prized slice of orchard fruit, a perfect peach, split and arranged like a flower, on Cook Mary's work table as a signal of trust and potential alliance. Mary discovered it during her morning preparations. For a moment her weathered hands paused over the offering. Then she looked around the empty kitchen, picked up the fruit, and ate it deliberately, savoring each bite. But trust, Isaiah learned, was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. Within hours word reached the master through channels Isaiah hadn't anticipated. The punishment this time was psychological rather than physical. The master called all the house servants together and delivered a speech about loyalty, about the consequences of misplaced affections, about the importance of reporting unusual behaviors among their fellow workers. Mary wouldn't meet Isaiah's eyes for weeks afterward. By autumn, Isaiah had identified potential allies. Cora, the seamstress, whose nimble fingers could pick locks as easily as thread. Jeremiah, the stable hand, whose knowledge of the property's layout was encyclopedic. And Samuel, the house cleaner, who had access to the study during specific hours. Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. Samuel would provide access to the study, Cora would examine the ledger for information, and Jeremiah would create a distraction if needed. Isaiah would coordinate, using his fruit delivery schedule as cover. The first phase succeeded perfectly. Samuel unlocked the study door during the master's afternoon ride, and Cora slipped inside to photograph several ledger pages with a small camera Jeremiah had found near the river dock. But their success bred carelessness. Samuel, emboldened by their achievement, began taking small items from the study, a pen, a paperweight, trinkets he thought wouldn't be missed. The master noticed within days. The investigation was thorough and merciless. The master questioned every house servant, cross-referenced work schedules, examined every inch of his study for evidence of intrusion. Samuel broke first, confessing to the thefts but not the greater conspiracy. However, his confession led to discoveries he hadn't intended. The hidden camera, Cora's lockpicks, Jeremiah's detailed maps of the property. The punishments were swift and calculated. Samuel was sold to a plantation in Mississippi. Jeremiah was demoted to field work. Cora received 20 lashes and was moved to the remotest worker cabin. Isaiah watched his allies disappear and learned the hardest lesson of all. Revolution required not just courage, but cunning that exceeded his master's cruelty. It was during this period of defeat that Isaiah witnessed something that changed everything. Late one evening, delivering fruit for an unexpected consultation, he arrived to find Emily in her father's study, not arranging the silver bowl, but reading the ledger. Her face was pale in the lamplight, her hands shaking as she traced entries with her finger. She was reading the notes about Jacob, about his resistance, his punishment, his mysterious illness. When she noticed Isaiah in the doorway, their eyes met for a long moment. In that gaze, Isaiah saw not the complicit daughter he had assumed, but a woman discovering the full extent of her father's depravity. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "About your brother? I didn't know." That revelation shattered Isaiah's understanding of his situation. Emily's ignorance meant the conspiracy was smaller than he had believed, but also more personal. Her father had hidden the worst of his crimes even from his own daughter. In the solitude of his cabin, Isaiah began to plan not just revenge, but revelation. The master's crimes thrived in secrecy, protected by the assumption that his daughter knew and approved. But if Emily could be shocked by the truth, others might be as well. Isaiah began keeping his own ledger, documenting not just his master's crimes, but the evidence that could prove them. He noted the dates of forced encounters, the names of other victims, the specific items used in the master's rituals. The broken pieces of Isaiah Dunmore weren't just healing. They were becoming weapons. He had learned patience from his failures, cunning from his defeats, and precision from his master's own obsessive methods. The silver goblet would shine again. The fruit would ripen. And this time, Isaiah would be ready. The storm that broke over Dunmore Plantation on the night of October 13th matched the tempest in Isaiah's soul. Lightning illuminated his small cabin in stark flashes as he sat holding the silver goblet he had carefully polished, the twin to his master's cherished vessel. In the flickering candlelight, Isaiah studied his reflection in the goblet's surface and saw a stranger. The boy who had once climbed peach trees with Jacob was gone, replaced by something harder, something capable of matching his master's cruelty with calculated precision. "What am I becoming?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible above the storm. The goblet offered no answers, only the distorted image of a man who had learned to weaponize his own suffering. But as another thunderclap shook the cabin, Isaiah's doubt crystallized into resolve. Jacob's face appeared in his memory, young, hopeful, trusting, and the hesitation fled from his heart like shadows before lightning. Isaiah's preparations had taken months of careful observation. He knew that Emily polished the master's goblet every Tuesday and Friday at exactly 10:15 in the morning. He knew that Cook Mary prepared the evening fruit at 4 o'clock, always selecting the ripest specimens for the silver bowl. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his cabin, Isaiah had assembled his evidence. Pages carefully copied from the master's ledger during Samuel's brief access, detailed notes about the consultation schedule, even sketches of the study's layout drawn from memory. But the most crucial element of his plan lay in a small glass vial, filled with extract from the orchard's most beautiful peaches, concentrated, sweetened, and enhanced with compounds that would make Edward Dunmore's final fruit exchange memorable in ways the master could never anticipate. Isaiah had spent weeks perfecting the preparation, testing it on insects first, then small animals, ensuring that the effects would be swift but not immediately apparent, allowing time for the master to understand exactly what was happening and why. The harvest celebration began at sunset, with the master's finest guests gathering to toast another profitable season. Isaiah watched from the shadows as carriages arrived, as ladies in silk emerged laughing into the humid evening air. It was during the dinner's second course that Edward Dunmore made his fatal error. Emboldened by wine and the admiration of his peers, he began regaling the table with stories of his innovative management techniques with the plantation's younger workers. "You see, gentlemen," the master's voice carried through the open windows, "the key is understanding what each specimen desires most. Young Jacob, for instance, had such touching concerns for his older brother's welfare." Isaiah felt the blood freeze in his veins. The master was joking about Jacob's death, turning his brother's suffering into dinner entertainment. In that moment, any remaining doubt about the necessity of his actions evaporated like morning mist. Isaiah moved through the plantation's evening routines like a man possessed. He carried the evening's fruit selection to the kitchen exactly as scheduled, but this time the basket contained special items prepared weeks in advance. Cook Mary, still wary after the earlier punishment, accepted the delivery without question. She arranged the fruit in Emily's silver bowl according to her usual pattern, the ripest peaches at the center, pears arranged like petals around the edge. Emily collected the bowl at her customary time and carried it to her father's study, where she placed it beside the freshly polished goblet. The ritual was so familiar, so automatic, that she never noticed the subtle sweetness in the air, the fragrance of concentrated peach essence mixed with darker compounds. As Emily retreated to her chair in the hallway, Isaiah appeared in the study doorway, exactly as he had hundreds of times before. Edward Dunmore looked up from his ledger with the satisfied expression of a man who had enjoyed an excellent dinner and anticipated an equally satisfying dessert. "Ah, Isaiah," the master said, his voice thick with wine and anticipation. "Perfect timing. I was just reviewing your brother's entries in my records. Such detailed notes I kept of our time together." Isaiah remained silent, but his hands moved with practiced precision, selecting fruit from the bowl and arranging it on the master's plate. Each piece was perfectly ripe, glistening with the enhanced nectar he had prepared. "These peaches look exceptional tonight," the master continued, lifting the goblet to his lips. "Almost too beautiful to consume. Though I suppose beauty exists to be consumed, doesn't it, boy?" The first effects were subtle. A slight flush in the master's cheeks, a barely perceptible tremor in his hands as he reached for another piece of fruit. Edward Dunmore had consumed Isaiah's preparations for years without suspecting that his victim had been learning, studying, preparing. "Something seems different about tonight's selection," the master murmured, his voice beginning to slur slightly. "There's an unusual intensity to the flavor." Isaiah stepped forward, no longer the subservient fruit-bearer, but something far more dangerous. For the first time in 12 years, he looked directly into his master's eyes without flinching. "Yes, Master Dunmore," Isaiah said quietly, his voice steady and clear. "Tonight's fruit is very special indeed, made from the same trees that provided refreshment during your consultations with my brother Jacob." Isaiah reached into his jacket and withdrew the pages he had copied from the master's ledger, spreading them across the desk like evidence in a courtroom. The careful annotations, the detailed records of abuse, the clinical notes about each victim's breaking point, all laid bare in the lamplight. "Subject shows remarkable adaptability," Isaiah read aloud, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Responds well to familial pressure. Recommend expanding protocols to include younger specimens." The master's eyes widened as he recognized his own handwriting, his own words turned into accusations. He tried to rise from his chair, but his legs wouldn't support him properly. You can't," the master gasped, his face now flushed and sweating. This is impossible." "Nothing is impossible, master," Isaiah replied, moving to stand directly beside the chair. "You taught me that. Every Tuesday, every forced consultation, every time you used fruit from my trees to buy silence about your crimes." Isaiah continued reading from the ledger entries, each word a deliberate wound. He read about the first time the master had forced him to taste fruit from the silver goblet. He read about the progression of abuse, the careful documentation of psychological breaking points. "Jacob Dunmore," Isaiah read, his voice growing cold. "Initial resistance higher than anticipated. Requires additional conditioning. Physical discipline may be necessary if compliance cannot be achieved through standard fruit exchange protocols." The master's goblet slipped from nerveless fingers, wine spreading across the Persian carpet like spilled blood. Edward Dunmore was beginning to understand that this wasn't just punishment, it was judgment. "The last entry about Jacob," Isaiah continued remorselessly, "subject expired during conditioning process. Cause officially recorded as seasonal illness. Recommend more careful calibration of physical pressure for future subjects." Emily Dunmore appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of her father's distress. She took in the scene with growing horror. The scattered ledger pages, her father's condition. Isaiah standing over him with cold justice in his eyes. "What have you done?" she whispered, moving toward her father's chair. "I have given your father exactly what he gave my brother," Isaiah replied, gathering the ledger pages methodically. "The same fruit, prepared with the same attention to detail he showed in documenting our suffering." Emily's eyes fell on the open ledger pages, and Isaiah watched her face change as she read her father's clinical descriptions of abuse, his careful records of psychological torture. "Papa," she whispered, but the word carried no love. Only horror at the scope of betrayal the documents revealed. Edward Dunmore made one final attempt to assert his authority, struggling to rise from his chair with the last of his strength. But his body, like his power, was failing him. "You forget your place," he gasped, each word a struggle. "I am your master." Isaiah leaned down until his face was level with his master's, close enough to see the fear finally dawning in those pale eyes. "No," Isaiah said quietly. "You were my owner, Jacob's owner. But tonight, Master Dunmore, you discover what it means to be owned by your own cruelty." Isaiah gathered his evidence methodically, leaving the ledger pages scattered across the desk where Emily could read every damning entry. As he moved toward the door, he paused for one final look at the man who had broken so many lives. Edward Dunmore sat slumped in his chair, his face flushed and his breathing labored, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes. The silver goblet lay overturned on the carpet, its contents soaking into the expensive fabric like guilt made visible. "The fruit was always poisoned, Master," Isaiah said quietly. "You just never tasted it until tonight." Behind him, Emily Dunmore wept as she read her father's ledger, finally understanding the true cost of the plantation's prosperity. And in his chair, Edward Dunmore faced the harvest of 12 years of systematic cruelty, reaped in a single night of perfect justice. The morning light found Isaiah Dunmore standing in his master's study, surrounded by the wreckage of an obsession. What had broken him now lay broken at his feet. Edward Dunmore sat motionless in his chair, his face frozen in an expression of shocked understanding. The silver goblet lay overturned beside scattered ledger pages, wine stains spreading across entries that detailed 12 years of systematic abuse. Emily knelt beside her father's chair, no longer the complicit daughter but a woman confronting the full scope of her family's crimes. The ledger pages lay scattered around her like fallen leaves, each one a testimony to horrors she had unknowingly enabled. The discovery spread through the plantation like wildfire. Cook Mary was the first to arrive, drawn by Emily's cries. She stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with the careful eyes of someone who had survived by reading danger in shadows. Behind her came other house servants, then field workers, all drawn by the unprecedented sight of their master's power structure collapsed in a single night. The ledger pages passed from hand to hand, and with each reading, understanding dawned. Jeremiah, someone whispered, reading one of the entries. Marcus, Samuel. Names of the disappeared, the sold south, the ones who had died of mysterious illnesses. The evidence was undeniable, written in Edward Dunmore's own meticulous hand. Each entry a confession, each notation an admission of guilt that no amount of social position could erase. Word traveled swiftly beyond the plantation's boundaries. The town doctor arrived first, summoned by Emily's desperate message. But one look at the ledger entries changed his purpose from medical treatment to official documentation. The sheriff followed, initially skeptical of claims against such a prominent family. But the evidence was overwhelming, not just the ledger, but corroborating testimonies from workers who finally felt safe to speak. By noon, carriages lined the plantation drive as neighbors, officials, and curious townspeople came to witness the collapse of the Dunmore family's carefully constructed reputation. Through it all, Isaiah moved like a man awakening from a long nightmare. The crushing weight that had pressed down on his spirit for 12 years was gone, replaced by something he had almost forgotten existed: dignity. He found Jacob's handkerchief where he had hidden it beneath his mattress, the last tangible connection to his brother's memory. For the first time since Jacob's death, Isaiah allowed himself to remember not the ending, but the beginning. 2 boys climbing peach trees, sharing secrets, planning futures they believed they could choose. The tears came then, not of defeat, but of release. Jacob was gone, would always be gone, but his death finally had meaning beyond suffering. The legal proceedings that followed were swift by the standards of 1857. The ledger entries, combined with testimonies from surviving victims, created a case that even the South's prejudiced justice system couldn't ignore. Emily Dunmore, confronted with irrefutable evidence of her family's crimes, made a choice that surprised everyone. She publicly supported the prosecution's case, providing additional evidence from her father's private papers. "I lived in this house for 24 years, she testified, and never questioned why certain workers disappeared, why my father kept such detailed records, why he insisted on personally selecting fruit for his private meetings." Victory, Isaiah discovered, was more complex than revenge. The master was gone. The system that had protected him was cracking. But the years of abuse had left marks that justice couldn't erase. He found himself returning to the orchard each evening, walking among the trees that had provided both the currency of his degradation and the instrument of his liberation. The peaches were ripening again, but they would never again represent the same innocence. Cook Mary approached him one evening as he stood beneath Jacob's favorite pear tree. "You did what none of us could," she said quietly. "But what you did? It changes you, doesn't it?" Isaiah nodded, understanding that she was asking not about the act itself, but about its cost to his soul. In the months that followed, Isaiah's story spread throughout the region's enslaved communities, not as a simple tale of revenge, but as something more complex, proof that even the most systematic cruelty could be turned against itself. Other plantations began experiencing problems, ledgers going missing, private meetings being interrupted, mysterious illnesses affecting particularly cruel overseers. The techniques Isaiah had developed were being adapted, refined, passed along through networks of quiet resistance. The message was clear. Abuse thrived in secrecy, but secrecy was a vulnerability that could be exploited. Isaiah found his peace not in the plantation's ruins, but by the river that bordered the property. It was there, watching the water flow toward distant freedoms, that he finally allowed himself to grieve, not just for Jacob, but for the boy he himself had been before 12 years of systematic breaking. The reflection that looked back at him from the water was different from the broken man who had stared into the water barrel that night months ago. This face carried scars, but also strength, the hard-won knowledge that even in the darkest circumstances, choice remained possible. Isaiah Dunmore's name would be whispered in dark corners for generations, not as a broken man, but as living proof that even the most cruel obsession could be turned into an instrument of justice. The fruit trees still bore their harvest each season, but they no longer fed on innocence. They had learned, as Isaiah had learned, that sometimes the sweetest revenge comes from simply letting truth ripen in its own time. If this story stirred something in your soul, share it with those who need to hear that even the most broken spirit can rise. Subscribe to hear more untold stories of justice served. And remember, sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with a single act of refusing to remain silent.